Well, the session is about civil resistance versus corruption. But it's more than that, and that's why there's the second line, because it's not just about fighting corruption. It's about, that's the negative. It's also about the positives, which is gaining accountability and gaining rights and gaining justice. That's at the heart of any struggle that's targeting corruption. So what I'm going to ask, first of all, is if I can have 2 timekeepers, 2 volunteers who will gently remind me if I talk more than 10 minutes in one shot, that they will just like raise their hand and like give me a signal to remind me. Nada is one, and how about someone from this side of the room? Gustav, okay. So if you see me talking, if you see that I'm talking more than 10 minutes in one shot, to let me know so that that calms me down, to remind me to like make sure that we are getting some input and discussion going from everyone in the room. Ideally, I would have loved to do some group exercises with all of you, but we don't have the time to do that properly. But so I want to like make sure that there's lots of time for discussion and thinking together about this, about corruption. Now, let's see. You'll forgive me if my... Okay, so before we start, you may think, I mean, there are lots of definitions about corruption. But before we start, and before I start actually asking a couple of people in the room to share some of their experiences, I want to just have us think a little bit about what corruption is. Because the way we define things impacts the way we approach them. And the way we define a problem will impact how we think of ways to basically address that problem. It's really, really important, and especially in corruption, because we have a basic definition and we have certain approaches, and in this session we want to think a little bit differently about approaches to fighting corruption that go beyond the standard thinking and that apply what we've been learning about civil resistance to corruption. So the first definition is something that many of you in the room are familiar with, and this is the Transparency International definition, which is the misuse of entrusted power for private gain. And I think it's a very good definition. It's short. It gets to the heart of what's going on. I mean, what is the essence of corruption? It's misusing power in some way or another by some kind of authority. And that authority can be, it can be in the government. That authority can be in the education system. That authority can come out of civil society. That authority can be in any kind of an institution or entity in society. Corruption can be found in many different parts of society, in the government and outside the government. But if you think of that, it just describes the phenomena. But there's but a word that we've been using throughout the past few days, and that word is system. And what I hope you will get from this session today is that we need to start thinking about corruption as a system, and that is how we are going to develop a new way to think about curbing corruption. So I'd like to propose a second definition. It's the Shaazka definition. And let's just say it's a systemic definition of corruption. And it's long, so you could never like talk about this, with people at a conference or something, because their eyes would glaze over. But from a strategic standpoint, one could say this is the strategic definition of corruption. So it's a system of abuse of power, of entrusted power. And what's in that system? I'll step back a minute. It's a system of abuse of entrusted power for private gain, but it can also be for other kinds of gain. Collective gain, political gain. So there are different kinds of gains that people can get. So for example, in political parties, corruption of political parties, it may not be for somebody to put money in his or her pocket. It could be to get money, for example, illegally to fund party activities, or to give out money for vote buying, for example. That's political gain. It's not personal gain, though one could say the person who gets elected is getting some gain down the road when they start putting money in their pockets. But there's also a party gain. So we have to think more broadly about what is the gain. And then we need to think that it's a system. So in that system, there are all kinds of relationships. In corruption, you have a corruptor or multiple corruptors and corruptees, multiple corruptees. Sometimes those corruptees are victims. They don't want to be a part of this corrupt relationship. Other times they're happy to go along with it because they want, because for example, if they want to pay somebody off to get something too. So both sides are gaining. But there are all these relationships in this system. And some of them we can see, they're obvious. But many of the relationships, some might say most of the relationships, are hidden. That's why we have this notion of transparency, to shed light on corruption, because so much of corruption goes on below the surface and we just don't know. So you've got all these relationships, many of them are hidden, and what happens with these relationships? They become vested interests. People are benefiting from the corruption, so you have vested interests to perpetuate the system, not to change it. And those vested interests, composed of all these relationships, can operate vertically within an institution. So, for example, within a government ministry, within a bureaucratic office, like where somebody goes to the local like office of like the Department of Transportation to get a driver's license, or to get a copy of a death certificate or something which they need. For example, a widow who needs that in order to get her widow's pension. So that can be within that particular office or institution. But then corruption can cut across different parts of the society, different institutions in the government, different sectors of the society, like the case of Khimki Forest. This corruption cuts across different parts of the government in Russia. It cuts across parts of the private sector in Russia, and it cuts across countries because it's also involving a multinational corporation, Vinci. So there you see it's horizontal. So all these relationships and all these vested interests are either within an institution vertically or horizontal. Pardon?
Это не так странно, потому что компания VC получает очень хорошие деньги за то, что она отмывает деньги для русских олигархов.
You're right, this multinational company gets a huge benefit because it's basically involved in money laundering for Russian oligarchs.
Thank you. That's a very good example, Yevgenia. And so it's not only corruption in the contracts, but then also money laundering. And so if we think about corruption as a system, then we can start thinking about how civil resistance functions to change that system. I'm jumping ahead, but how does civil resistance function to disrupt that system of corruption? Finally, I'd like to leave you with a third definition, and that's a bottom-up definition of corruption. This is about how corruption impacts people in their daily lives. So this is a people-centered definition. And this comes from Aruna Roy. Does anyone know who Aruna Roy is? Or what the MKSS movement is? Some people are shaking their heads. Who would like to tell the rest of our group what is the MKSS movement? Huh? Okay. MKSS movement is otherwise known as the Right to Information movement in India. It lasted 10 years. It stemmed out of people working in extremely poor rural communities in Rajasthan, and they were fighting poverty, but then while they were fighting poverty, they started realizing that they were hitting against corruption, and it was corruption that was actually part of a major cause of the poverty in these rural communities. And then when they started hitting corruption, they realized that they needed information, and it was through information that they could fight the corruption. And so this was the birth of this movement, which led ultimately to the passage of a people-centered, user-friendly Right to Information Act in India, which is being used today. And last year at FSI, we had someone named Vijay Anand, who is the founder of a movement who is actually using that legislation as part of its strategy to empower everyday citizens to fight corruption. So that is a people-centered definition. So it's the external manifestation of the denial of a right or of an entitlement, a wage, a medicine. And that goes to the heart of what civil resistance to curb corruption is about. And because when one starts to study campaigns, social movements, civic initiatives targeting corruption at the grassroots, one finds, as mentioned yesterday, that they are not necessarily calling themselves anti-corruption movements, but they're fighting corruption. But what they are actually saying is, we're fighting to have our clinic opened. We're fighting so that our children get textbooks in the classroom to which they're entitled. We're fighting because we don't want politicians stealing, vote buying and distorting, democracy and the political process in our countries. So for them, the struggle is about something else, but it is intertwined with corruption because they are fighting corruption as it is intertwined with these sources of oppression and injustice which are hurting them, either throughout their society or in their everyday lives. Nada. Oh, that's the 10-minute. Great. Okay. Thank you. So, before we go on to the next slide, does anyone have a thought or a comment or a question? Yes, Mary.
When you say it's integral to civil resistance, maybe not everybody has put the dots together in this particular sense. There is a reason that civil resistance movements, unless they have to be covert or clandestine, as in the first Intifada, the Palestinians, there's a reason that they choose openness. They do not have secret meetings. Everyone is welcome at the rally. If you know that your church is filled with the Stasi in East Germany, you ask that everybody stand up and say who you are and where you're from in order to confront the Stasi with the fact that you're no longer afraid. I think it's important to say that openness in organizing the search and quest for the definition of goals and objectives, the use of consensus, all of this is important. And it's linked to the philosophical tradition of understanding that your goals, your ends, are linked or connected to your means. In other words, how you fight is going to affect the outcome. So I just wanted to put a hard line under this. Transparency is therefore completely, totally compatible and obligatory in civil resistance, and it's part of what you are talking about.
Thank you. That's a really wonderful connection between the two, and it's fundamental. It's absolutely fundamental. Thank you. Stephen, and then Jenny, and then Mireille.
I just want to appreciate your broader definition of corruption, in that there a lot of groups do some very good work, such as Transparency International, going after illegal corruption. But there is the legal corruption as well, such as the capture of regulatory agencies by the very industries they're supposed to regulate, and other things that that in many ways. It's even more important to have popular nonviolent movements to challenge.
Yeah, that's true. And in a lot of anti-corruption initiatives, they don't make that distinction because they actually see corruption in a more holistic way than the official definitions. Jenny, and then Mireille, and then I'll move on if that's okay. And then Michael, and then I'll move on. Oh, and then Oscar. Okay. That's.
Thank you, Shaazka. I just wanted to say well done for the definitions. But I also wanted to say that there's like this gray area between corruption, patronage, entitlement, and affirmative action. You know, these liberation movements that rule many different governments, they will say that we come from the marginalized in society and it is now our turn to access opportunity. And it's portrayed as affirmative action, but meanwhile it becomes corruption. So it's like very important to look at that gray area between affirmative action and when it actually now becomes corrupt.
I mean, you're talking something that others have said, that it's like people who, for example, when you have a transfer of power from one group to another, that the new group sometimes sees that they now, they're entitled to the same benefits that the former corrupt ones were enjoying. And that is actually part of, one could say, changing the way societies view corruption, that some of the campaigns that I've researched have been doing, which is like changing this notion of entitlement, and that, you know, I'll give you an example later, and remind me if I forget. But yeah, that is a big challenge, and it also points to something that we are talking about, I think, or we're thinking about, which is transformations of power actually do not necessarily lead to less corruption. And I'm going to ask all of you later why you think that's the case. So I'll give you some time to think about that. Mireille had her hand up.
Thank you. I was just wondering if we could explore the different links between corruption at top level of governments and at bottom level. For instance, in a country where it is well known that the top leaders are corrupt, is it still possible to find the kind of corruption that affects people's daily life, like you know, a small clerk in some obscure office, making you pay $1 instead of the 10 cents that is required for you know, a paper that is that you have entitled to.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because we're going to get into that. We're going to get into some interesting cases. And I'm actually going to show you some really short clips from a couple of campaigns that actually address that. So thanks. And I'm sorry, one more. Oscar had his hand up, and then we're going to move on. Sorry.
Yo creo que todas las movilizaciones que se dan en el mundo hoy son movilizaciones contra la corrupción, fundamentalmente en el Estado.
I think basically all of the social mobilizations that you see in the world right now are essentially against the corruption that we see in states.
Es decir, el movimiento se convierte en una exigencia por la transparencia.
In other words, movements are becoming themselves a demand for transparency.
En Cochabamba nosotros no sabíamos quiénes eran los que habían decidido privatizar el agua, qué empresas, cuál era el consorcio, quiénes la conformaban.
In Cochabamba, we didn't know who had decided to privatize the water, who the companies were, who was in the consortium, and who made up the consortium that did this.
Fue la movilización social que obligó al gobierno a presentar los documentos.
It was the social mobilization that forced the government to divulge the documents.
Entonces nos enteramos que Bechtel, Abengoa y Edison habían conformado un consorcio en las Islas Caimán de una sociedad con apenas $10,000.
So we realized that Bechtel, Abengoa, and Edison had actually created a company in the Cayman Islands that was made up with an initial investment of just $10,000.
Cuando pudimos leer el contrato de privatización, una gran parte de los artículos de ese contrato eran artículos de confidencialidad, es decir, que un tercero no podía saber qué contenía ese artículo del contrato.
When we were able to read the articles of confederation of this consortium, we saw that a lot of the clauses actually were confidential, so that third parties couldn't even know what these clauses were.
Cuando leíamos el contrato y preguntábamos a las autoridades por qué habían aprobado un contrato así,
when we read the contract and we asked our authorities, why did you ever approve a contract that was written this way?
ellos decían que posiblemente la traducción del inglés al español había fallado.
They said, oh, maybe we got a bad translation from English to Spanish.
Ese tipo de información es, la gente dice, ¿cómo es posible que puedan hacer un contrato y una ley que perjudica al pueblo en esas condiciones, ¿no?
So people are saying, you know, how is it possible that you can legally have a contract like this that damages people in these conditions?
Y eso mueve a la gente, ¿sí?
And when people find out about this, it moves people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect example. It's a perfect, yeah. And I think you are all starting to make these links that corruption is not something that's abstract, that's just out there. It's very concrete, and you're giving concrete examples of how it actually functions in these kinds of non-transparent, unjust policies and actions that can happen that take place in societies, decisions that are made by governments. So it's an excellent example, and it echoes a lot of the research I've been doing. And so if I ever do the book number 2, which I don't think I'm going to do it, but still, I would love to document in depth your case and some of the others that I've been learning about, because these are actually tackling corruption.
Shaazka,
Yes.
у нас по компании Vansi то же самое. Есть конституционное соглашение с ней.
What does the French company Vansi?
Yes.
They have the agreement, like concession agreement, and Russian party has a concession agreement with them. Very similar to the one Oscar mentioned.
Isn't that interesting?
Но мы много раз пытались добиться того, чтобы прочитать его.
And it took us a while to, be even able to read the agreement. We tried so many times, we couldn't get access.
И хотя это федеральный проект,
and it's a federal project, but we couldn't get,
но мы получаем официальные отказы, потому что нам говорят, что это коммерческая тайна.
We're getting official letters, federal letters, saying that we are not able to reveal the information because it's a commercial interest project.
Мы 5 лет не можем добиться этого документа.
For 5 years we're fighting just to get the agreement.
And you still haven't gotten it? No.
Нет.
Yeah. No, I mean, you see, these are common practices. Yep. And you see how information is actually very powerful, and that's why, I mean, information is actually not. I mean, that corrupt entities don't want to release that information. And in fact, you can all, just for your information, some of you will know this, and then I'm going to move on. In many of these types of agreements, there are actually 3 sets of agreements. There's the agreement that the government holds. There's the agreement that that is held by the accountants and the shell companies that are outside of the country. And then there's the 3rd agreement that, for example, the company can hold. And I mean, and then I could give you a link of exposure of something like this with land grabbing in Malaysia. So these are what we fight against. Now, what that means is that these are some challenges, but at the same time, we have a lot of sources of power and tools and nonviolent weapons that I would call tactics that we can use. We can still disrupt these kinds of corruption, and that's the important thing. So now let's think, how are we going to disrupt them? I'm going to move on to the next slide, and before I move on, I'm just going to say that if we want to think about disrupting systems of corruption, we need to just think for a minute about traditional top-down approaches to curbing corruption, because this is what we've been hearing about for 20 years. And it's all changing now. Even now, elites are embracing the notion that corruption cannot be curbed unless citizens are involved. There's a huge paradigm shift in the development and anti-corruption communities in the world. But I want to ask you a question. There is an underlying assumption about all top-down approaches to fighting corruption. And that assumption is once anti-corruption structures are put in place, illicit practices will change. What do you think is the flaw in that assumption? Why is that an assumption and not a reality? One person who would like to venture an answer. Stephen.
Yes, actually, let's take a case in Cameroon where we have the National Anti-Corruption Commission. So it is not going to eliminate corruption because, first of all, that structure depends on the political power for instruction. And in certain developing countries, the function of that structure is very complex in that it is still linked up to the central machinery. So it ends up receiving instruction on who to pursue or who to attack, and that may have political underpinnings. So it becomes very, very difficult that the putting in place of an anti-corruption structure can invariably lead to an elimination. But it had some gains. It will actually make some effort, like awareness and also fear. But to say that tangibly it can be very significant, we need to rethink it again. So we need other support mechanisms that can help support the structure for it to become more effective, like the citizen action.
Exactly. That's exactly the case. Arwa is raising her hand, and then I'm going to give you the next slide. Thank you, Stephen. You've given a concrete example of how that assumption, how that way of thinking is an assumption, and that assumption is actually flawed. Yes, Arwa.
And I think really that the
can you speak up, please?
Yeah, one problem can be that even, for example, where states take certain initiatives, like for example informing an anti-corruption commission and thinking that they have done their job of combating corruption by forming an anti-corruption commission, whereas in fact if there's no real political will, and if that commission, however well staffed it might be and however well equipped it might be with the resources, if they're not receiving support from other sections within government, then their work is probably going to end up either being ineffective or being sabotaged. And not only within government, but I think as we move further through different layers of society, the private sector and civil society need to be involved in that. So any national anti-corruption plan needs to involve all these sectors, all these stakeholders.
Thank you. That's exactly right. So I'm going to move to the next slide, and I know Kusta wants to say something, but I'm going to move to the next slide, and you will see, in fact, that you have basically given the answer to that assumption. Kusta.
I was going to say, in my country, we've got, I don't know how many corruption-busting institutions created by the state.
Yeah.
But now, the state, what it's doing, a corrupt act, once they discover that they are involved in it, they turn that into a policy position of government and change it to suit the corruption instead of fighting the corrupt.
That's an interesting strategy.
And then what they do, of course, they populate all these things with corrupt people and make sure that they... But no, seriously, that's what they're doing.
Very interesting. So in that case, I don't know, but maybe you think that I'm just like thinking that I'm like a record that keeps on, with the scratch that keeps on saying the same thing. That's why at the heart of this, we need to think about how do we disrupt this. And so let's think about the strategic value of civil resistance. This is extra institutional pressure. It's coming from outside of the institution or institutions or entities, whether they're in the state or they could be in other parts of the society, but it's outside of the entities that are pushing for the change. When power holders in these entities are corrupt or they're unaccountable, they're not answering to anyone, and institutional channels are blocked, or they're ineffective. So for example, an anti-corruption commission, there may be really good, dedicated people in that commission who want to fight corruption. But then, as Arwa said, there may be no real political will to fight it. Or there may, even if there is political will, there may be other parts of the the government that are corrupt and are trying to prevent it. For example, the Attorney General's office, or the police, or the military, or oligarchs, or that are close to people in the government. So that's the value that people, that regular citizens bring to curbing corruption. And I love this quote. I'm not going to read it, but you can read it. But I think it really does address this, that, you know, sometimes you need help from the outside. Even if you're even inside a system, people cannot do it on their own. And that's where citizens have their role. So I'm going to move on. Now, so then what are the dynamics of civil resistance to curb corruption? And notice I didn't say to fight corruption. I want to be an optimist. I don't want to just keep saying we have to fight, and fight forever and ever and ever. I think, and in my research, I have found that people are actually curbing it. They are impacting it. They're not eradicating it completely, but they are curbing it, and they're making improvements in their lives. So that's why I like the word curb. So what are the dynamics? 2 easy things to remember to curb corruption. And this is taking all of the civil resistance theory and notions, and I'm trying to condense it into 2 things to remember. So when people are talking to regular citizens, and citizens come to them, for example, they're a grassroots CSO, and citizens come to them with complaints, or saying, you know, we don't know what to do, and, you know, every time I get pulled over by the police and I'm forced to pay money, otherwise they'll put me in jail or whatever. How do you explain to them that they have a choice, that they can do something, and that together all of you can make a difference? How do you explain to them what civil resistance is and how it works? 2 things to remember. 2 hands, 2 things. Disruption. We've been hearing it the whole week, and I've been talking about it. Disruption. We disrupt the system. You cannot change every single corrupt person. It's impossible. You can change some of them, but you cannot change all of them. Especially since you don't even know everyone who's corrupt, because so many of those corrupt relationships are below the surface. But what you can do is disrupt that system somehow. So you are disrupting those dishonest relationships and the status quo within the systems of disruption. On the other hand, the other part of civil resistance, Peter talks about shifting loyalties. That is the other element. We can also talk about it in terms of corruption as engagement, which is winning people over to the campaign or the movement from the public and from within the corrupt system. We are pulling them over to our side. We are pulling people over because without people, there can be no people power. And we are winning people over from within the corrupt system because, as you know, there are many honest people within the corrupt system. But they all feel alone too. And they know, they're scared that if they try to do something, they're going to get squashed. But we can engage with them, and through the power that people have, extra institutional pressure, they can be supported in what they're doing. So those are the 2 dynamics of civil resistance to curb corruption. So what does it produce? It exerts pressure on the state, as well as on other sectors of society where there's corruption. It weakens the sources of support and control for those unaccountable corrupt power holders and their enablers. And what's an enabler of corruption? Does anybody want to share a thought about what is an enabler of corruption? They're not just the corrupt power holders, but there are the enablers of corruption. Yes, that's an enabler of corruption. How about, and what are some other enablers of corruption? Does anybody have an idea? Nada?
The system, the environment sometimes is going to be able to host corruption and to hold it and keep it. So the system, the structure, and the society.
The structure of the society. And who is in those, and there are people in that society, right, who are helping to keep it moving along. So for example, accountants, lawyers. I'm not saying anything bad about lawyers, because there are many wonderful lawyers that are leaders of nonviolent campaigns to fight corruption. But then there are the lawyers that, for example, set up the shell companies overseas, where money can be laundered and illicit contracts can be made. So there are then lobbyists, for example, for countries. So that are where there's a very corrupt authoritarian government, and those lobbyists go into other countries and say, oh, we're not so bad, it's, slowly, we're really trying to make reforms, whatever. So those are enablers of corruption. So what civil resistance does is then we can support for them, for not only the corrupt power holders, but the enablers. And the third thing, and this is really important, and it gets back to the Gandhian practice of civil resistance, is civil resistance is, in essence, collective non-cooperation with corruption. People somehow are not cooperating with the system of corruption in one way or another. Whether they're engaging those to their side or whether they're disrupting. One can think about it in terms of non-cooperation. So I'm going to move on, and then we can take some comments and things. But so then what is a bottom-up approach to curbing corruption? This session is not about saying that one way is better than another way. It's not that top-down is bad and bottom-up is good. There's no debate. You need both to curb corruption. But what does and that's a holistic approach to fighting corruption. But what does the bottom-up approach bring to fighting corruption, to curbing it? Nonviolent movements and campaigns and grassroots civic initiatives, can they disrupt horizontal and vertical forms of corruption? We've been talking about that. They embed anti-corruption into a larger set of goals in the society for accountability, for participatory democracy, and for social and economic justice. They create political will. Where there is no political will, they can generate that political will, and they can bolster real, genuine efforts for reform and for curbing corruption within governments or other entities. They can complement and reinforce legal and administrative mechanisms. So, for example, how can they complement and reinforce a legal or a law or some sort of a mechanism? For example, using the Right to Information Act in India. Regular citizens are using that to fight petty bribery that they face every day. They can, and this is really important too, nonviolent movements and campaigns can empower and protect integrity champions within the system who are pursuing accountability, reform and change, and honest state and non-state power holders who really don't want to engage in corruption, but sometimes they feel they don't have any choice. So all of these things are not theoretical, and this is the lead-in to the next part. These are things that I observed from research that I've been doing over the past, now it's like 3 years. But I had the good fortune of getting support from the United States Institute of Peace and from ICNC to do research, to document, to basically, in some cases, find cases around the world of nonviolent campaigns and social movements and civic initiatives that are targeting corruption in one way or another. And I found over 30 initiatives. Now, I mean, if I I could tell you probably they're like 40 or 50 in total, because almost like every 2 weeks I'm finding out another initiative that is targeting corruption, even if it may not be the focus of its campaign. Out of those 30 civic initiatives, I narrowed it down to 14, and I conducted really in-depth research on them. Those cases, if you added up the people, were millions and millions of people around the world, and these are the countries where I did in-depth research of the cases. And so I cannot tell you about all of them. I'm happy to be in touch with you. And the book that's coming out this year that Jack mentioned will actually have in-depth case studies of these movements and campaigns and initiatives around the world. The next thing I just want to share with you something, though, that's really interesting is the tactical range of civic initiatives targeting corruption. Because here we have a lot of learning, too. Because, as you know, every nonviolent movement or campaign creates new tactics. And the tactical repertoire of campaigns and movements that target corruption involve things that we have not seen in other types of campaigns, and they're really interesting. So I want to show you some really short clips of what it means. Some of these you know. I'm not going to read them all. But for example, some of you may be wondering, what does monitoring of officials or institutions or budgets or spending mean? You know, what is that? What does that look like? What is a tactic, a nonviolent tactic of monitoring? I'm going to show you. Oh, yeah, is this it? Now I'm just going to go up to 16 here. Not yet. Getting there.
Okay, this is just the end. Here we go.
این سرک نوین است.
Can you hear this?
پروژه به شکل آسان میتوان دریافت مردم چه اندازه خود را در
Most of you won't understand this.
کمک‌ها مسئول
کی دیده بود دیگه وقتی اومد قرارداد از این موضوع می‌بینید چند تا قرارداد بده به چی کیفیت چی نگاه میشه میرم آقا تو میگم گفت دیگه ما هست از این دیوار رفته شده ما دیوار رفته شده
این سرک بر طول 13.3 کیلومتر و عرض 4 متر به یک شرکت ساختمانی به قرارداد داده شده است. ولی بیشتر قسمت‌های سرک کمتر از 3 متر فاصله شده
دو متر 60 دو 70 اینجا میشه 2 اگه قرار باشه ما 4 متر بگیریم که میره
واسه نظر انجینیر شرکت تطبیق کننده را نیز داشته باشید.
این لایه باید 4 متر باشه. شما لایه فعالی هم میگه بود متر تپر تا که دو لایه خلاص شده 4 متر که پول خونمون این پول ملت ایجاد نداره. شما از این حرفا شما به فکر بعد داخله اومد ما این دو دفعه ما را خود دفاع میکنه. تو بگه نه ما را خود که نمیتونه تو میتونه خیانتی رو بره. همین انجینر شاهد گفت یک قسمت سرک که 100% با تکمیل شده همین سرک. خب ببینید تا این قسمت سرک خلاص شده دو لایه ریخته شده. یک تا 14 میلی که پیشتر گفتم یک لایه 14 میلی ریخته میشه یک تا 10 میلی روی ریخته میشه که تکمیل شه. تمام میگی این قسمت تا کجا بگیره؟ خب اگه تا اینجا هم ما بگیریم بیخی تا اینجا خب همین کمپنیه اوکی ریگه سمت اینجا خود این دیگه شعبه درازی هم تو شاید سرک اینجا سمت رای قرار بود 4 متر کار بشه خب باید سرک تا اینجا کار بشه خود از اینا میبینه کل هم نه زیرسازی نه غیر این چیزی در اصلا 4
مرحله بعدی برای انجام مشکل جلسه بود نظارتی ولایتی است. این بود شامل رئیس اقتصاد، نماینده تامین کننده، نماینده وزارت، نماینده شورای ولایتی.
Okay, so who would have thought that that's civil resistance? But that's civil resistance. Now, I can assure you that the people in the villagers in this campaign did not wake up and say, we're going to engage in civil resistance to fight corruption. But that's what they're doing. That is civil resistance. That's a tactic. And many, many campaigns targeting corruption are using this tactic. Sometimes they invent it by themselves, and other times they are learning for others. So this actually was something that was, the monitoring here was something that was inspired in part by the right to information movement in India. And it's taking place in Afghanistan, and it took place in 400 villages in Afghanistan. And I can tell you, though, that they didn't just wake up one day and say, let's go measure the road. What you are seeing is the culmination of probably about one year of planning and strategizing and working in this community. This is part of a one-year project, and I don't have time to tell you everything that's involved to get to this point. But this is just a piece of a campaign that lasts 1 year in each village, all volunteer-based. No one gets paid to do this. People are taking their time when they barely have time to go and till their fields, but they are finding the time to do this. Hardy?
No, I mean, I was just going to say, you view it as a tactic and also view it as a basic building block of movement, a basic building block of self-organization. I mean, it reminds me of a campaign I know that happened in the 1980s in India, in which a river was being polluted by major national corporations with the very best interest in the government. The government was supposed to monitor the water, it wouldn't, and the main act of self-organization was getting the water readings for the poisons, making that information public and using that to mobilize. It was all voluntary.
All voluntary, this helps us to think really differently about tactics and the range of actions that we can engage in. Oscar has a comment or question?
O sea, tú puedes encontrar luchas como la que has mostrado, puedes encontrar, como en Sudáfrica, institucionalidad que permita una lucha contra la corrupción.
You can see a lot of examples here, like you've shown us, or in South Africa, struggles against institutionalism that allows for corruption.
Pero hay algo muy simple que permite que haya corrupción desde en la calle, como dice la compañera, hasta en un palacio de gobierno.
But there's something very simple that allows corruption to go on in the streets, like our sister here has told us about, or in the halls of government.
Es que hay impunidad total.
There's total impunity.
Nadie es castigado.
Nobody ever gets punished.
Entonces, como nadie es castigado, pues todos se animan a ser corruptos.
And
casi todos.
Since nobody ever gets punished, everybody's encouraged to be corrupt, almost everybody.
Entonces yo creo que el gran desafío es cómo como sociedad civil creamos una institucionalidad afuera del Estado para que todos puedan rendir cuentas y ser sancionados porque no solamente están impunes los ladrones, también los asesinos, los violadores, los genocidas, ¿no?
So I think that one of the great big challenges for us as civil society is to create an institutional mechanism outside the state in which we can punish those who are corrupt. And it's not just people who rob, it's also people who steal, who murder, and even people who commit genocide.
Well, I mean, these are, one could say, sort of existential issues that face movements, and about what should be the priorities, what should be the demands, what should be the long-term outcomes. Impunity is a big issue, and in fact, Transparency International is going to be launching a major campaign because it sees this at the heart of the oppression that corruption creates on people's lives. But I mean, again, thinking about punishment. I'll give you an example of Afghanistan. When I was interviewing one of the leaders that helped, that sort of catalyzed these campaigns, they were saying there's very little rule of law in Afghanistan, and people know they can't be punished, or very few would ever be punished. So they said we needed to find another way to be able to tackle this because we just don't have the rule of law now. So I think, again, this is all part of, I would say, the strategic considerations that movements need to take when they're thinking about what are their demands, what are their goals. And sometimes there can be punishment or justice. Let's think about it in terms of justice, not punishment. But in other cases, people decide they just can't do it. Now, for example, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, you could say that there was an example of a movement targeting corruption that did have justice in a way. To target the whole system, they wanted to really shake it up. So they actually focused on something that angered people, which was the prime minister bought an exclusive apartment through a series of steps that he paid roughly 500 euros for. It was worth 350,000 euros. And in fact, that apartment was part of a collection of apartments that were supposed to be for refugees of the Balkan Wars. And he got it for 500 euros. So in that case, they launched a campaign, a very innovative campaign using digital resistance and humor and graffiti. And in the end, he resigned. His party forced him to resign. So you could say there was not a law that punished him, but there was some justice. But, you know, again, they made a strategic assessment about what they needed to do. I'm going to move on. Yeah.
Которого мы добились совместными усилиями многих стран.
I wanted to mention some real ways to fight corruption, which is used in many countries by joint efforts.
Это очень интересная история, и я хочу рассказать.
I hope it will be an interesting story for everyone, so I would like to share it with you.
У нас был юрист, который совершенно случайно выяснил, что налоги, которые собираются в России, затем через налоговые же инспекции передаются в офшорные зоны.
So we had a lawyer who quite accidentally came onto the information that the taxes that are being collected from the public were then sent offshore.
И это были огромные суммы, это были миллиарды.
So we're talking about large sums of money, billions of dollars.
Он составил иск и обратился с этим иском в российский суд.
So he prepared a lawsuit and he filed this lawsuit in a Russian court.
И его арестовали.
And as a result, he was arrested.
Этот юрист был подвержен многим пыткам.
He was tortured in jail.
И он, например, был в таком тяжелом состоянии, что, например, он у суда во время заседания просил воды, и ему отказывали в воде.
He was in a really terrible condition, and they continued torture by denying him water even during a court hearing.
В конце концов, на него одели наручники, и его избили до смерти.
He was actually beaten to death while in the handcuffs.
И имя этого человека Сергей Магнитский. Он работал вместе с Браудером.
The name of this person is well known now. It's Sergei Magnitsky, who worked with Browder.
И вот этот Браудер, он решил не оставлять этого дела, и он начал вести настоящую кампанию, чтобы приняли закон, в соответствии с которым можно было бы арестовать счета вот российских коррупционеров, которые отправляют свои деньги за рубеж. Вот эти счета арестовать на Западе и не давать им визы.
The Browder didn't leave this alone, and he started a massive campaign which was targeting creation of a list of Russian officials whose accounts, if they participated in the system of oppression, would be arrested, and they would also be denied visas if they wanted to visit Western countries.
Я очень активно приняла участие в этой кампании, и меня тут же обвинили в шпионаже в пользу Америки.
I was a very active participant in this campaign. I was immediately accused of being a spy for the United States.
Но нам удалось сделать так, что в Америке это приняли, а в Европе пока нет.
We're happy to say, though, that the United States ultimately passed this legislation. Unfortunately, Europe hasn't yet.
Но одна проблема. Принять приняли. Но вот как туда помещать людей, в этот лист Магнитского, нам никто не объяснил. И я пытаюсь, вот я сейчас в Америке, да, я пристаю ко всем. Вчера к девушке из Госдепа приставала. Я спрашиваю, как нам туда помещать людей? И никто мне не может в Америке это объяснить.
And passing a law is good, but the question now is how to ensure enforcement how do you make sure that the guilty parties their names will be put on that list? And I'm here in the United States now, and I've been bothering tons of people. I was bothering this woman from the State Department yesterday, and I still cannot understand how can you actually initiate the process of putting somebody's name on that
Потому
list.
что моего товарища, журналиста Химкинского, который писал про коррупцию, его убили по приказу нашего мэра, и сейчас этот мэр находится в Европе и хорошо себя чувствует. И мы должны наказать этого человека. И, Shaazka, у меня просьба, пожалуйста, объясните мне или узнайте, пожалуйста, для меня, как я могу поместить этого человека в этот магнитский закон.
A friend of mine who covered corruption widely was ultimately killed at the order of a mayor who is now in Europe, and he is. It seems like he's doing just great in Europe. So please, Shaazka, I'm asking you, I'm asking everybody who can help me find out how can we be instrumental in putting people on that list.
Well, we need to talk about that at lunch. But I think that's I mean, these are I mean, it's about first getting certain laws passed and then finding ways to use the laws. And for example, that's where I know, for example, like in cases like this where international solidarity and international organizations can play a very important role, like Sherpa in France, which is it's a human rights lawyers group, and they are very effective. But again, and I don't think there's one way, and there are many ways that we need to try to do that. But okay, Nancy, and then we're going to move on. Because I'm just looking, we end at 12:30, right? Yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to respond to that. Work for Freedom House, and we've been working really hard and trying to pass the law. But just to assure you that we are still working with other organizations like ICNL and others on making sure that it's not just a symbolic act of the law, but actually the implementation of this. And almost on a weekly basis, meeting with congressmen and people in the State Department to make sure that this will be implemented.
Спасибо.
No, I mean, and if you would like to share anything with me, be happy.
You know, one thing to keep in mind, and I'm going to move on, but sometimes the institutions or the legal system may not react the way we want, but then a lot of people then do parallel activities, and this is a nonviolent tactic. So, for example, if the law isn't implemented properly and you don't have the list, then you can have like a civil resistance where all those names, if you can gain access to some of those names, are very publicly listed anyway. So you get the information out, even if it's not officially through the law. I mean, so there are many ways to think about this. I want to show you another clip. This is going to be a 5-second clip of what does a low tactic mass action look like that targets corruption? And I hope I'm not going to goof this up. Yeah, low risk mass action tactic.
You can just explain low risk of what?
Low risk of violent repression. Thanks for asking. Low risk of violent repression. Okay, and here we go.
Bizi desteklemek durumundaydı. Gönüllü bir şekilde yoğun şekilde desteklediler.
Eylemin başarısını sağlayan yurttaşların evlerinde, kendi mekanlarında ışıklarını yakıp söndürerek yapmaları biçiminde çıtanın çok aşağıdan yapılmasıydı. Biz sokaklara çıkılacağını pek düşünmemiştik. Fakat coşku öylesine yüksekti ki insanlar sokaklara indiler, kendi sokaklarında ellerinde mumlarla, çiçeklerle, hoplayarak, zıplayarak, şarkı söyleyerek eylem yaptılar.
Çok farklı görüşler, Türkiye'de hiçbir zaman yan yana gelemeyecek kesimler, farklı sosyal tabakalar, işte Sabancı'nın ikiz kuleleriyle varoşlardaki gecekondular aynı anda yakıp söndürdü. Her yaştan insanın katıldığı bir eylem oldu.
Şu dersi çıkarabiliriz. Bir, bu eylem
This is from the Citizens Initiative for Constant Light that took place in Turkey in 1997. And you will see echoes of that in what's happening right now. If you will not believe it, but Guess how many millions of people are estimated to have participated in this campaign over the course of 6 weeks? Millions. 30 million. Practically the whole country. It started off with turning off your light for 1 minute every night at 9 o'clock. And after 2 weeks, people got they lost their fear to act. People were scared. Anytime there was a protest in Turkey at that time, it would be crushed violently. But then people started coming out onto the streets, as you saw in this clip. So an everyday act, which Macha has talked about, everyday act of resistance, everyday act, switching off your light, became a low-risk mass act of resistance in the country. Now, the book Civilian Jihad has a chapter by Arwa Hassan and me, which talks in part about this case. So if you're interested to learn about it, you can get it in that book. I want to show you something else. Face the People Fora. What does that mean? This is very interesting. I'm going to move it up to 18, and then you're going to see a clip of this tactic. This is a forum where citizens have gathered information about shoddy development projects in their communities, and then they invite the power holders to meet with them. And believe it or not, the power holders come. Because they know the citizens have information and they're worried about what they're going to say. So I want to just get to 16. It is, let's see, what is it? It's 14. Sorry, I went ahead too much. Okay.
Kama uwe na uhusiano kama mjukuu wake, rafiki yako, kitu namna hiyo. Tuko na watu walioshuhuda kwa mpira hizo basari. Sasa tujiulize tuelekea wapi? Sisi walikuwa tuelekea wapi haswa? Hii basari tutaipata kweli ikiwa tuna uhusiano karibu na mheshimiwa ama mtu aliyeko katika kamati?
Okay, so I'm going to move on, but I just want to show you another nonviolent tactic. I'm going to pass this around. The 0 rupee currency. Ask me after the session if you want to learn about what it's about. This is a nonviolent weapon against corruption. I'm going to show you one more nonviolent weapon against corruption that comes from Italy, from a nonviolent youth resistance movement fighting the mafia in Palermo. This is a nonviolent weapon. You know what this is? A list of hundreds and hundreds of businesses that have publicly pledged to no longer pay extortion money to the mafia. And believe me, it did not just happen in one day. But this is a nonviolent weapon, and this disrupts the system of the mafia in Palermo, because if people stop paying extortion money, what's going to happen to the system that the mafia has of repression and stealing and corruption? So moving along, I need to stop in 5 minutes. So I just want to move along to some things. We've been having some good conversations, so I'm going to ask you if you could just give me the last few minutes to just share with you some final thoughts. In my research, I was shocked to find out how many common attributes I kept finding across the different studies. Different kinds of corruption, local corruption, national corruption, corruption in development and anti-poverty programs, corruption in education, corruption in political parties, corruption in the electoral system, corruption in the whole entire system, cutting across everything. I found cases in tackling virtually every kind of corruption you can imagine. You can find them everywhere, from democracies, semi-democracies, to authoritarian regimes. And it goes back to what we've been discussing about the whole week, that conditions are not the determinants of success, that actually it is strategizing, planning, sequencing, nonviolent discipline, engaging, all of those things play such an important role. So if somebody says to you, oh, How can you fight corruption in a country where the education level is so low and they've just come out of a war and women are oppressed and you know, there's no rule of law and blah, 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 blah? And I will say to you, they are fighting corruption more effectively than in the West. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but I will say women and youth are playing galvanizing roles in these campaigns, and also lawyers. So, because lawyers are good people too. Defining methods are very common. Did you all talk about defining methods? This is a term that was coined by Dr. Kurt Schock. And basically, this is a series of sequenced activities around which an array of nonviolent tactics revolve. So a defining method, for example, is a social audit, which has many steps. So, for example, it means training citizens to read budgets and going out in Afghanistan, for example, and measuring the streets and measuring the buildings. Then mobilizing the community, sharing the information, calling the power makers to come to a meeting, and then afterwards getting them to promise to make changes, and then following up. So you could say that's a defining method with many steps and many different kinds of nonviolent tactics. Civil resistance is magnified through, in many cases, engagement with selected power holders and honest officials. Success in one struggle inspires others. So the Indian Right to Information movement has inspired people in Afghanistan. It inspired people in Kenya. The people in Kenya are inspiring people in Tanzania and Uganda, and it goes on and on. And intangibles are important. This is something to just think about. Intangibles are the things we cannot grasp, and yet they are so important in nonviolent campaigns and movements. Collective ownership. If people do not feel a sense of collective ownership in what they're doing, it's really doubtful it's going to work. Volunteerism. People do not get paid to do this. It's not a job. You're doing it because you love your community or your country or your society and you want to make it better. Creativity is essential. You've heard this before this week. And dynamism. Really dynamic campaigns. Changing, thinking, doing. This is different from, in the development world, what we have. Formulaic citizen engagement projects that external actors come up with. And it's like a recipe. You do this, and you do this, and you do that, and poof, they think corruption's going to go away. And poof, they think citizens are going to somehow exact accountability. These campaigns are not recipes. And they are far more effective than these formulaic funded projects that we often see in the global south. I've got to cut in 1 minute, and I'm just going to tell you that I will be sharing my PowerPoint. And in fact, look, it's ending by itself. I can't even go forward. So I don't know what happened, but there you go. I'll let you read that. I see one person has her hand up, and then I think I need to stop. So yes, Kadi.
Weapon actually said no corruption, no impunity in the campaign in Dominican Republic. But after a while, people were really engaged, but they lose faith in the movement because they say that corruption is part of their culture. I mean, it was like the culture in Dominican Republic, as in many Latin American countries, is part of it. So they were like, we're fighting against this big monster that we are not going to reach our goals. So it made an awareness of the population, the people get involved, but then the movement get diluted in the time. So I think sometimes when the culture is really corrupted, I don't know if you can answer me this or you have some experience, but how to keep the movement alive throughout the time to make the people believe that you can do something to stop corruption.
The short answer is that looking at, for example, the research of all these campaigns, corruption was linked to things that mattered to people in their everyday lives, or it was linked to some grievance that was generally held in the society that angered a lot of people. So it's really important that any campaign against corruption does not talk about it in the abstract. It has to be real for people. So, and that's why, for example, so many of these campaigns were not technically anti-corruption campaigns, even though that's what they were fighting. When citizens understand what it's about, that it's corruption that's related to something, like in their community, or something in their society that many people are upset about, then they're more likely to become involved. Another issue is finding things that people can do. So finding, creating, inventing nonviolent tactics that somehow disrupt the system that regular people will do. Because not everybody can be a young activist and go out and do things all the time. But there are so many different things that other people can do. For example, like in Turkey, turning on the light, turning off the light for 1 minute. And then, you know, I think this notion that we talk about in civil resistance of small victories, there has to be a sense that we're making progress. So campaigns build in small victories. So for example, a campaign that gets access to the budgets, that's not their objective. But that is the first small victory that the citizens have achieved. And then they take that and they go then, and for example, they will go and to the site of the project and measure it and find things out. That's another small victory. Then they will, for example, call the public forum and have power holders there. And then get the power holders to promise in writing that they're going to change things. That's a big victory. And then there's the follow-up to actually make sure it happens. That's the huge victory. So every step of the way, there are built-in little victories. And I'm happy to talk to you about that later. But I've got to stop now. Thanks for your attention. And love to talk to you more about it.